Do you remember the grocery items every poor kid in the 1970s remembered, when stretching pennies shaped every trip to the store? These items filled lunchboxes, cupboards, and dinner tables, holding families together. Looking back now, is it surprising how much those simple foods still stay with us? Plastic butter tubs in the fridge were the universal sign of a poor kid's household in the 1970s. No family on a budget had real Tupperware stacked neatly in their refrigerator. It was always country crock, parquet, or blue bonnet tubs that had long since been emptied of margarine. The minute you lifted one out, you knew it was a gamble. You might get mashed potatoes, beans, leftover chili, or the dreaded mystery stew your mom had made by tossing in whatever was left from the week. Kids everywhere knew the disappointment of reaching for what you thought was butter for your toast, only to open the lid and find green beans floating in broth. These tubs never sealed perfectly, so the fridge often carried a faint smell of onions and gravy. Yet families swore by them because they were free, durable, and endlessly reusable. They stacked easily in cupboards, filled with everything from lunches to cookies for road trips. Taking potato salad to a picnic? You brought it in a butter tub. Nobody batted an eye because that was normal. The bright yellow lids became part of the scenery of poor kitchens everywhere, reminding kids that when you had little, you made the most of everything. Glass peanut butter jars reused as cups were another trademark of poor family kitchens. Brands like Skippy and Jif often sold their spreads in heavy glass containers that doubled as drinking glasses once emptied. Mothers washed them out carefully, peeled off the labels, and suddenly you had a set of sturdy cups. Kool-Aid, sweet tea, or plain tap water tasted just as good out of a peanut butter jar as it did out of any fancy glassware. Some jars even came with printed designs, cartoon characters, or logos that made them more fun than anything store-bought. Kids claimed their favorites, and God help you if a sibling drank out of your peanut butter glass. They rattled in dish racks, thick enough to survive endless drops, and often outlived real glasses that broke in a year. Families never wasted money on drinkware when they were essentially handed out for free at the grocery store. They were heavy, practical, and often mismatched, but that was part of their charm. Guests drank from them without complaint because everyone had them, and everyone understood. In poor households of the 1970s, those jars were proof that nothing useful ever went to waste. Coffee cans for storing flour or sugar were a sight you could find on any kitchen counter. Once the last spoonful of Maxwell House or Folgers was brewed, the metal can was scrubbed clean and filled with dry goods. The plastic snap-on lid kept everything fresh enough, and the can itself was nearly indestructible. Poor families stacked them on shelves, labeled with masking tape and marker to tell sugar from flour, rice, or cornmeal. No matter how many times they were washed, they always carried that lingering coffee smell, which sometimes flavored the flour if it sat too long. But nobody minded. It was thrift in action, and that mattered more than taste. Kids grew up recognizing the sound of those plastic lids popping open as part of the rhythm of cooking at home. They doubled as storage for nails, screws, crayons, or buttons, making them as much workshop and craft supplies as kitchenware. Lined up in neat rows, they became a badge of pride, practical, reused, and full of possibility. Buying new canisters was out of the question when every household already had a pile of coffee cans ready to go. Powdered drink mixes in recycled jars were another staple of poor kitchens. Kool-Aid, Tang, and the cheaper off-brand packets were mixed into old pickle jars or mayonnaise jars, usually with a handwritten label taped to the side. Mothers would dump in the powder, stir it with sugar, and store it in the fridge to save time later. The faint smell of vinegar often lingered in those jars, so your fruit punch sometimes carried a tang that did not belong. Kids gulped it down anyway, because sweet drinks were a treat no matter what. When guests came over, pitchers on the table were rarely new. They were jars that once held pickles, pasta sauce, or peanut butter. Nothing was wasted, and every container found a second life. The bright red or orange liquid inside was enough to make a poor kid feel like royalty, even if it was little more than sugar water. In the 1970s, recycled jars filled with cheap drink mix were the closest most families got to luxury beverages, and everyone remembered them with a mix of fondness and a laugh. Bologna ends from the deli were the mystery meat of childhood in poor households. At the end of the slicer's work, when the big log of Bologna was too short to fit properly, the store sold the leftover ends at a discount. Families lined up for them, taking home bags of odd-shaped chunks. They were fried in a skillet, stacked between bread, or diced into casseroles. Sometimes the slices were thick and uneven, curling up in the pan like little cups of grease. Other times they were mashed into sandwiches with mustard, a meal that felt like a feast even though it cost pennies. Kids complained, but they ate every bite because meat was meat and Bologna was king in a poor kitchen. Families stretched those ends as far as they could, using every scrap in lunches and dinners. It was cheap, salty, and filling, which was all that mattered. Today, it might seem funny, but for kids in the 1970s, the taste of fried Bologna ends was unforgettable. Puffed rice or puffed wheat cereal was another grocery item poor kids could not forget. It came in giant plastic bags, so big they barely fit into the pantry. The cereal itself was bland, light, and tasted like cardboard without help, but it was cheap and lasted forever. Mothers dumped heaps of sugar on top just to make it palatable, turning breakfast into a half-sweet, half-grain ritual. Kids would crunch through mountains of it, sometimes soggy, sometimes stale, but always there in the morning. The sound of that oversized bag crinkling was part of every poor family's kitchen soundtrack. It did not come in colorful boxes with prizes or mascots, but it filled bellies for pennies. Families bought it by the sack because it stretched across countless mornings. Looking back, it might not have been anyone's favorite, but it was dependable, and every poor kid remembered it. Generic cola in black and white cans was a true mark of poor shopping trips. The plain white can with blocky black letters simply said COLA and nothing more. It was stacked high in discount aisles, promising a cheaper option than Coca-Cola or Pepsi. Poor families grabbed cases of it, knowing it would never quite taste the same as the real thing. The fizz was weak, the sweetness flat, but it was soda, and that was enough to make kids feel like they were part of the fun. Every once in a while, you got a can that seemed oddly metallic, but nobody poured it out. Parties, cookouts, and family nights featured those plain cans lined up on tables like silent guests. They were stripped of branding and glamour, but they delivered what mattered: a sugary, carbonated drink that felt like a treat. Kids rolled their eyes when friends brought over Pepsi, but at home, generic cola was good enough. To this day, people smile when they remember those plain cans, symbols of thrift and compromise. Cabbage and potatoes by the sack were the backbone of poor family meals. Sold in bulk for cheap, they could be stretched into soups, stews, or fried up for dinner. Bags of potatoes sat in cool basements, while cabbage heads lingered in the fridge for weeks without spoiling. Every meal seemed to find a way to use them: boiled, mashed, fried, or shredded into coleslaw. Kids groaned when cabbage smell filled the house, but parents knew it was hearty, filling, and nutritious. Sometimes it was all you had, but it was enough to keep everyone going. In winter especially, potatoes and cabbage carried families through when money was thin. They were humble, unglamorous foods, but they held a place of honor in poor households. Every poor kid in the 1970s remembered those giant sacks, knowing dinner would almost always include one or both. Store-branded ice milk instead of ice cream was the closest poor kids often got to dessert. True ice cream cost more, but ice milk came cheaper, often in large cardboard tubs. It was thinner, less creamy, and melted faster. But to kids, it was heaven. Spoons clinked against bowls as kids piled it high, often doused in chocolate syrup or sprinkles to mask the lack of richness. The flavor sometimes tasted watered down, but when it hit your tongue cold and sweet, you did not care. Families celebrated birthdays and holidays with ice milk, treating it like the finest dessert in the world. It was a compromise, but one that made sense when money was tight. Every poor kid remembered crowding around the freezer, hoping there was still a scoop left in the tub. For many, that ice milk was the taste of childhood. Carnation. Instant breakfast was marketed as nutrition in a glass, but poor kids knew it mostly as a sugar rush before school. The powder was mixed into milk, promising vitamins, minerals, and energy, but mostly tasting like chocolate milk with extra grit. Parents loved it because it was fast and cheap, filling kids up in minutes. The powder never fully dissolved, leaving clumps at the bottom of the glass that kids stirred endlessly with spoons. Strawberry, vanilla, or chocolate, all of them packed with sweetness that got you out the door buzzing. Mothers bought it in bulk, convinced it was a healthy shortcut, even if it was closer to dessert than breakfast. For kids, it was better than cereal some mornings, and for parents, it was one less thing to worry about. Today, people laugh at the idea of calling it instant nutrition. But in the 1970s, Carnation Instant Breakfast was a grocery item every poor kid remembered with a mix of nostalgia and sugar-coated energy. Meatloaf mix packs were one of those grocery store shortcuts that poor families leaned on constantly. They were sold as little envelopes of crumbs and seasoning, promising to help stretch a single pound of ground beef into a full family dinner. Mothers poured the contents into a bowl, added beef, maybe an egg if one was handy, and sometimes even milk or ketchup to bind it all together. The packets all looked the same, no matter what brand you bought, and they usually tasted the same too, salty, savory, and heavy on onion powder. Some moms swore by one mix over another, as if that little paper envelope was a secret family recipe. Kids never realized until later in life that most of the magic in those meatloaves came straight out of a store brand packet. The seasoning was always salty, with hints of onion and garlic, masking the fact that the real bulk of the meal came from breadcrumbs instead of meat. Kids grew up with dinners where you could count the beef more easily than taste it, but no one complained. It filled plates and bellies. Leftovers were sliced cold the next day into sandwiches, making the mix seem like 2 meals in one. Meatloaf mix made families feel like they were getting creative with dinner, even when it was simply stretching what little they had. In the 1970s, those cheap little packs turned ground beef into survival, and every poor kid remembers them well. Canned pork and beans were everywhere in poor households. Whether dumped into a saucepan and served hot, eaten cold straight from the can, or spread over toast, they were one of the cheapest and most reliable sources of protein on the shelves. The beans were soft, the sauce sweet, and the little bits of pork more symbolic than substantial. Sometimes the pork was nothing more than a cube of fat floating on top, which kids treated like a prize or a joke, depending on who found it. The smell of beans simmering on the stove was so common that it became part of the background of weeknight dinners. Every kitchen seemed to have a pyramid of cans stacked in the pantry, waiting for their turn. Kids often joked about trying to find the tiny square of fat that counted as the pork. Sometimes it was a win if you spotted it. Other times it felt like the can had cheated you. Still, nobody cared because the beans themselves were hearty and satisfying, especially when paired with cornbread or rice. Parents bought cases of them because they lasted forever in the pantry and could be stretched into a meal in minutes. They might have been humble, but they were filling, and that made them unforgettable. Old cans with pull tabs you yanked off were a grocery store standard before safety design was a priority. These cans came with thin aluminum rings you pulled hard, tearing away the top with a sharp edge that could slice a finger. Kids learned quickly to be careful, but the tabs themselves often ended up scattered across counters, floors, and car seats. The floor of many kitchens and cars had at least one of those sharp little crescents hiding somewhere. Kids collected them for fun, stringing them into chains or tossing them like coins until an adult caught them. More than one barefoot dash through the house ended in tears after stepping on one. They were like little razor-sharp souvenirs of every soda or soup can opened in the kitchen. Parents warned you not to leave them lying around, but somehow they were always underfoot. More than one kid pressed one flat and tried to use it as a toy, usually ending in a cut or a scolding. Poor families did not waste time worrying about safety. They were just glad to have affordable groceries. Looking back, it is amazing how normal those dangerous pull tabs felt, and every poor kid remembers them with equal parts nostalgia and caution. Powdered potato flakes in cardboard boxes were the budget version of mashed potatoes, and poor families kept them in steady rotation. The box promised light and fluffy potatoes in minutes, but the taste often had a faint chemical tang that no amount of butter or salt could hide. Still, they were fast, cheap, and made it easy to stretch a meal when fresh potatoes were too expensive or had already sprouted in the sack. Some kids swore they preferred them because they were smoother than lumpy homemade potatoes, though most secretly longed for the real thing. The smell when you opened the box was oddly comforting, even if the taste never lived up to the promise. The cardboard packaging always sagged after a while, spilling flakes in the cupboard like snow. The powder itself looked like snow and puffed dust into the air when you stirred it into hot water. Sometimes the mixture came out runny, sometimes so thick it could stand up on its own, but kids ate it anyway. Covered in gravy, it was almost convincing, and after a while you stopped noticing the difference. For poor families in the 1970s, powdered potato flakes were not about flavor. They were about survival, and every kid remembers them piled high on dinner plates. Fruit-flavored gelatin in store brands was another treat every poor kid knew. Forget the colorful boxes of Jell-O with smiling mascots. Poor families reached for the plain white boxes with blocky lettering that simply read, "Gelatin Dessert." The packets mixed into boiling water the same way, and the wobbly, jiggling result looked just like the real thing. The colors always looked brighter than the flavors tasted, neon reds and greens that promised fruit but delivered sugar water. Moms sometimes poured it into mismatched Tupperware molds, turning out lopsided wobbles that slid around the plate. Kids didn't care if it was off-brand. Watching it jiggle was half the fun. The taste, though, was always a little off, more sugary water than fruit flavor. Kids poked at it with spoons, laughing as it trembled, and sometimes mothers added canned fruit to give it more substance. Even off-brand gelatin was enough to feel like a party when served in little bowls after dinner. It was cheap, easy, and stretched a few cents into a family dessert. No poor kid forgot that wobbly, neon-colored treat sitting in the fridge, waiting for supper to be over. Big bags of popcorn kernels were one of the cheapest snacks a poor family could buy. Sold in plain plastic sacks, they sat in pantries for months, ready to be poured into a pot with a little oil. The popping sound filled the kitchen, and soon the air was heavy with the smell of toasted corn. Every family had their own method, whether it was shaking the pot furiously or covering it with a heavy lid and hoping for the best. Some kernels exploded so violently they bounced out onto the floor, where kids snatched them up before the dog did. Burnt or not, the giant bowl of popcorn felt like a feast for everyone crowded on the couch. Of course, half the batch was often burnt, and the other half stubbornly stayed unpopped at the bottom of the pan. Kids argued over who got the biggest bowl and sprinkled salt by the handful, trying to make it taste like the movie theater version. Even burnt popcorn was devoured quickly because it was warm, crunchy, and cost almost nothing. Popcorn was a poor kid's snack of choice, filling bellies when nothing else was around. That crinkly bag of kernels is one of the strongest grocery memories of the 1970s. Cheap sandwich cookies from discount aisles were the knockoff Oreos that poor kids grew up on. They looked the part, 2 dark chocolate cookies with cream in the middle, but the resemblance stopped there. The cookies were dry, the cream chalky, and the flavor nowhere near as rich. Still, kids stacked them high, dunked them in milk, and pretended they were the real thing. Some even scraped out the filling and mashed several cookies together, inventing their own double-stuffed versions before Nabisco ever did. At birthday parties or school lunches, showing up with these instead of Oreos was a badge of thrift everyone understood. Still, kids twisted them apart, licked the filling, and dunked them in milk just like the brand name version. Parents bought them in bulk because they cost half as much, and that made them worth it. Lunchboxes rattled with baggies of discount sandwich cookies, and no one cared about the difference once hunger set in. They were a little disappointing, but for poor families they were dessert, and that made them special. Every poor kid remembers them sitting on the shelves, always within reach when Oreos were not. Spam or luncheon loaf was the classic mystery meat of poor kitchens in the 1970s. The rectangular can popped open with a sharp key, revealing a pink block of processed meat that slid out with a wet plop. It was fried, baked, diced into casseroles, or eaten cold on bread. The gelatinous coating clung to the meat like glue, and kids dared each other to touch it before it hit the pan. Once cooked, it crisped at the edges, sizzling loudly and filling the kitchen with a salty aroma that made mouths water. Even if everyone joked about what it was made of, plates were always cleaned when Spam was on the table. The smell was salty and strong, and the texture was both soft and rubbery, depending on how you cooked it. Kids joked about what exactly was inside, but they still ate it when it hit the skillet. Fried crisp with eggs in the morning, Spam could almost pass for bacon if you squinted hard enough. Parents liked it because it was cheap, shelf-stable, and could stretch into multiple meals. Today, it is a punchline, but back then, Spam was survival, and every poor kid knew its taste by heart. Powdered non-dairy creamer was another grocery staple in poor households. The little tubs or cardboard canisters promised a rich and creamy coffee experience, but in truth, it was just sweetened powder. Parents stirred it into their cups daily, but it showed up in other recipes too. Some families used it in hot chocolate when milk was scarce, giving it an oddly sweet, almost artificial flavor. Others spooned it into pancake batter or instant mashed potatoes, trying to stretch meals just a little further. Even kids who didn't drink coffee grew up tasting it one way or another, since it seemed to sneak into everything. Some mothers dumped it into mashed potatoes to stretch the milk, or added it to cake batter when real cream was too expensive. The powder always clumped, leaving strange lumps if you were not careful. But families shrugged and stirred harder. It was versatile, cheap, and stretched across weeks of meals. Kids grew up seeing it on tables next to the sugar bowl, as permanent a fixture as salt and pepper. Poor families depended on it to fill the gaps, and it became one of the most remembered items of the 1970s pantry. Frozen TV pot pies were one of the cheapest hot meals you could buy, costing as little as 39 cents each. The little foil pans came with flaky crusts that hid more pastry than filling. Inside, you might find a few sad cubes of chicken, a couple of peas, and lots of thick gravy. They took forever in the oven, testing everyone's patience as the smell drifted through the house. Impatient kids often burned their tongues on the first bite, learning the hard way that the molten center needed time to cool. Even so, having your very own pie, even a tiny one, felt like a special dinner in households where portions were usually shared. The crust burned if you left it in too long, while the middle stayed frozen if you pulled it out too early. Kids poked at them with forks, blowing on the steaming edges and waiting for the lava-hot gravy to cool. Despite the flaws, they were exciting. A whole pie of your own for dinner. Parents stocked freezers with stacks of them because they were quick, cheap, and easy to serve. Every poor kid in the 1970s remembers peeling back that foil top, hoping the filling would be more than just sauce. Store-brand crackers in wax paper sleeves were a poor family's version of saltines. They never came in a fancy box with a smiling logo or a promise of crispness. Instead, they arrived in plain packaging, and inside were fragile sleeves wrapped in wax paper that always seemed to split open at the worst moment. Compared to premium saltines, they were pale, uneven, and more prone to breaking into crumbs before you even opened the sleeve. Still, every poor kid in the 1970s remembers them because they were always there, cheap, dependable, and endlessly versatile. Mothers crumbled them into meatloaf to stretch the beef, ground them into breading for fried pork chops, or dropped them into bowls of watery soup to give it some heft. Kids smeared them with margarine or peanut butter, pretending it was a snack worth bragging about. Sometimes they were so stale they bent instead of snapped, but nobody dared throw them away. The sleeves themselves had a tendency to split wide open in the cupboard, leaving piles of crumbs that became a magnet for ants if you weren't careful. Yet, for all their flaws, those wax paper-wrapped crackers held an important place in the pantry. They were cheap enough to buy in bulk, filling enough to make a thin dinner stretch, and simple enough that even a child could grab a handful when hunger struck. Looking back, they might not have been the crisp, perfect saltines that kids at better-off houses enjoyed, but they carried the same sense of comfort. A bowl of soup or chili without them just felt incomplete. Poor kids in the 1970s may not have gotten the brand name Crunch, but they still got the same memory. the sound of a wax paper sleeve tearing, and a kitchen table covered in crumbs. Discount brick cheese ends were a grocery store secret that poor families swore by. Instead of neatly packaged blocks or fancy wedges, the deli counter sold bags of odd-shaped scraps left over from cutting down larger wheels. They were mismatched, uneven, sometimes dried out at the corners, but they came cheap, and that made them gold. Parents tossed them into casseroles, melted them into sauces, or layered them between bread for grilled cheese that oozed unpredictably but still satisfied. Kids never knew what flavor they were getting. A bite of cheddar here, a mouthful of Swiss there, and sometimes a tangy surprise no one could quite identify. The textures varied wildly too. Some bits melted smooth, while others stayed rubbery no matter how long you cooked them. Still, it was all cheese, and in a poor household, that was luxury enough. Mothers often used them for macaroni and cheese, where the different flavors blended together into something rich and hearty, even if the result was inconsistent. Some families grated the scraps by hand, careful not to waste a single ounce. The bags were heavy, awkward to store, and often leaked a bit of oily residue, but they were worth every penny. For poor kids in the 1970s, those cheese ends were a reminder that the scraps of the grocery store could still make a meal that felt indulgent. Today, people might walk past them without a glance, but back then, they were a prize for anyone stretching a budget. They were never pretty, but they melted into memories that stuck just as firmly as the cheese did to the pan. Pickled pig's feet jars in the aisle were one of those unforgettable grocery store sights that poor kids never forgot, even if they never tasted them. The glass jars were large, filled with cloudy brine, and inside floated pale, knobby pig's feet that looked like something out of a science classroom jar. They sat on shelves near pickles and sauerkraut, daring anyone to buy them. For poor families who grew up on scraps and traditions, pickled pig's feet weren't shocking at all. They were simply another way of making sure nothing went to waste. The sight alone, though, made kids gag. They pressed their noses to the glass, staring in equal parts disgust and fascination at the toes curling under brine. Jokes were made every shopping trip. Want some pig's feet for dinner? The answer was always a chorus of groans. But in many homes, the jars came home, were opened and eaten with vinegar, bread, or potatoes. They were salty, chewy, and strong-smelling. But for families who had little, they were packed with protein and calories. Grocery stores stocked them faithfully, knowing there was always a customer for cheap pickled meats. While many poor kids never touched them, they remembered the sight vividly. That row of jars glistening under fluorescent lights was a reminder that the 1970s grocery store was filled with things that reflected thrift and tradition, not just convenience. Today, the thought might bring a shudder, but in those days, they were normal, a small window into how far families would go to make sure nothing was wasted. Bagged day-old donuts were the treat poor kids treasured even if they were stale. Supermarkets and bakeries sold them in clear plastic bags, often tied with a twist, marked down because they hadn't sold the day before. They were smushed, misshapen, sometimes hard around the edges, but to kids, they were as good as gold. Powdered sugar ones left your face a mess, chocolate frosted clung to the bag in melted patches, and jelly-filled leaked sticky trails before you even got them home. But nobody cared. They were sweet, they were cheap, and they were donuts, and that was enough. Families often froze them, thawing a few at a time for breakfast or dessert. Sometimes kids tried to soften them in the microwave, which usually made them soggy instead, but they ate them anyway. Parents loved them because they made children happy without draining the grocery budget. A bag of day-old donuts turned a plain Saturday morning into a celebration. Kids compared which ones they grabbed, fighting over the glazed or chocolate while the plain cake donuts were left for last. For poor families, even stale donuts were a luxury, and they created memories just as sweet as the sugar dust left on fingertips. Looking back, no one remembers the dryness or the stale texture. They remember the thrill of opening that bag and feeling like you had scored a treat that was just for you. Powdered gravy mix packets were a quiet hero of the poor family pantry. They came in thin paper envelopes, promising rich, savory gravy in just minutes. All you had to do was add water, stir, and hope it thickened properly. Poor families used them constantly because gravy could cover 1,000 sins. Dry meatloaf, bland potatoes, or leftover bread all tasted better drowned in it. Sometimes the powder clumped stubbornly, leaving little brown lumps floating in the sauce. Other times it came out too runny, more like soup than gravy, but it was still poured generously over everything. Kids grew up thinking dinner wasn't complete until the pot of gravy hit the table. The flavor was always salty and artificial, but nobody complained because it turned a cheap meal into something hearty and comforting. Parents relied on those packets to stretch food, making scraps feel like a proper feast. A spoonful of instant mashed potatoes with powdered gravy could feel like a meal even when the rest of the plate was empty. For poor kids, the smell of that mix whisked into boiling water was part of the soundtrack of dinner. It might not have been gourmet, but it was dependable, and it brought comfort when comfort was in short supply. Looking back, powdered gravy mix was more than just a pantry staple. It was a survival tool, a flavor boost, and a memory every poor kid still carries with them. Macaroni and cheese in a box was the go-to. It was dinner when you had $3 left, when the fridge was empty, or when you just could not deal with cooking. It was fluorescent orange, creamy if you stirred it right, and ready in 10 minutes. Every kid loved it. Every college student lived on it. You did not need measuring cups, timers, or even much skill. Just a pot, a spoon, and enough water to boil. It made everyone feel like they knew how to cook, even if it came from a box. Leftovers barely existed because no one ever left any. And sometimes the cheese powder was the only bright thing in the kitchen. You could get a box for 30 cents, sometimes less. Now, that same box is creeping past $1 or more. And the deluxe kinds, the ones with real cheese sauce? Forget it. The value meal just got a markup. And that stings because boxed mac and cheese was supposed to be inflation-proof. It was never about gourmet. It was about survival. Now it is in a weird middle zone. Still cheap, but not cheap enough to ignore. Not when you used to buy 5 boxes for the price of 1. And yet it still sits in the pantry. Still shows up when you need it most. Mac and cheese in a box used to be your fallback. Now it is more like your compromise. Every time you saw it in a catalog, it looked like joy in a box. A bright red roof, that big white dog on top, and a little hand crank that promised a mountain of shaved ice on a hot summer day. The Snoopy snow cone machine was not just a toy, it was an event. And if you had it, you threw the kind of parties that kids remembered. It came with little paper cups, tiny flavor packets, and a scoop shaped like Snoopy's head. Everything about it screamed deluxe. But the truth? That thing barely worked. The crank was stiff, the ice melted fast, and the syrup ran out in 5 minutes. And still, everyone wanted it. It was sticky, messy, and almost always disappointing. And yet no one cared. The act of making the snow cone mattered more than eating it. The kid who had it was the one who got to stand behind the counter, smiling like a carnival vendor. You wanted it. Because it meant your family could afford fun. It meant you had a kitchen big enough for a snow cone stand and parents who did not mind the mess. It was never about the taste. It was about showing off. The kid who had it only made snow cones a few times a year, but you would never forget watching them do it. You stood in line behind 6 other kids just to get a watered-down cherry slush in a cup half the size of your palm. But that did not matter. You were part of it for 5 minutes, and then it was over. Canned corned beef hash was salty, soft, and a little strange, but it fed you well. You cracked the lid, heard the suction break, and slid out a solid block of meat and potatoes. It looked like dog food and smelled like breakfast, and somehow it worked. You'd fry it in a skillet until it crisped on the edges and serve it with eggs, if you had eggs. If not, it stood on its own, greasy and rich and completely satisfying. There was no guessing what was in it. You just trusted that it was meat and starch and enough to hold you till dinner. You flipped it carefully so it didn't fall apart. Sometimes it stuck to the pan and you scraped it up anyway. It hissed in the skillet and filled the house with the kind of smell that said, "There's food on the stove." Leftovers went into sandwiches, folded into omelets, or straight into a bowl with ketchup. It was versatile because it had to be, and filling because it needed to be. You might not have liked how it looked, but you never argued with how it made you feel. Some people added onions or ketchup, others just let it sizzle. It tasted better than it looked. And on mornings when the cupboard was close to empty, corned beef hash reminded you that a can opener and a hot pan could still mean a good meal. In the 1970s, it was one of the cheapest ways to feel like you were eating something hearty, and it stuck with you. If you were lucky enough to have your own ride, or just a friend who did, then you know the magic of the 8-track tape. That clunky plastic cartridge snapping into the dashboard like you were launching a space mission, the whir of the tape kicking in, the music blaring from cheap speakers that made everything sound like it was recorded underwater. But you did not care. This was your soundtrack. Maybe it was Fleetwood Mac, or the Rolling Stones, or that one song you rewound again and again just to feel something. It was messy, sure. The tape would switch tracks mid-song without warning. Sometimes it would get stuck and melt in the heat. But it was yours. In a world before streaming, before playlists, before carrying your entire music library in your pocket, this was it. You blasted it with the windows down, your arm out the side, fingers slicing the wind. Every drive felt like a scene from a movie. You were not going anywhere important, but the music made it feel like you were. The 8-track was not just about listening, it was about becoming. Finding yourself between fuzzy choruses and that familiar click as it looped back to the beginning. Butter used to feel fancy, but it was still affordable. You could pick up a stick for baking or slather it on toast without checking the price tag. It made everything taste better: vegetables, pancakes, popcorn. And it lasted a while. That yellow block lived in your fridge like a quiet workhorse. These days, butter has entered luxury territory. A 4-stick pack that once cost $2 now hovers near $6 or more. And if it says European or grass-fed, forget it. You start budgeting how much butter you use in every recipe. Is it worth it for cookies? Can you get by with margarine? Even restaurants are charging for real butter now as if it is truffle oil. It is frustrating because butter is not optional. It is essential. It is what made bland food better. So now you cut thinner slices, use more oil, or freeze what is left, but deep down, nothing replaces it. Butter is still king, even if it is wearing a price tag now. You could hear it before you saw it. That low rattle of gears and rubber on pavement. When a Raleigh chopper rolled by, every other bike might as well have disappeared. It had high-rise handlebars, a banana seat, and a frame that looked like it belonged in a motorcycle gang, not the school bike rack. And the kid riding it? Always a rich kid. Always. They would glide past you like they were in a magazine ad, not even pedaling half the time. That gear shifter in the middle of the frame looked like it was built for a race car. You had never even seen a gear shifter on a bike before. Yours probably came from the back of a hardware store. This thing looked imported from the future. And let us be honest, those bikes were not cheap. Parents who bought them were not just giving their kid a ride. They were buying attention, pride, and a neon-colored way to stand out. You tried not to care? You told yourself your bike got the job done. But deep down, watching them speed off with one hand on the bars and the other holding a can of soda, it burned. That chopper was not just a bicycle. It was a moving billboard that said, "My parents can afford it, yours cannot." Canned pork and beans were a meal, a side dish, and a backup plan all in one. You bought them by the case, stacked the cans in the pantry, and knew you were covered for at least a week. They were soft, sweet, and strangely satisfying. Thick sauce, tender beans, and tiny bits of pork if you got lucky. Sometimes it was one chunk of pork per can, but it made you feel like it counted. You heated them on the stove or ate them cold when time or patience ran out. Served over toast, beside hot dogs, or just in a bowl with a spoon, they got the job done. You could dress them up or leave them as they were. Either way, they filled you up. They stuck to your ribs and stained your plate, but you cleaned it with a piece of bread. There were no rules about how to serve them, just instincts and whatever else was on hand. Sometimes you added mustard or onions, trying to change things up. Other times, you were too hungry to bother. Kids ate them without question. Adults relied on them without pride. The label was always familiar, even when the brand changed. They were warm. They were cheap. They were always there. Nobody called it fancy, but nobody went hungry either. In a time when grocery bills had to stretch, this little can was one of the best returns on a dollar you could ask for. Pork and beans were the taste of getting through it, and somehow they stuck around because they worked. The shoes were weird. Let's just get that out of the way. They looked strange, they felt strange, but that was the point. In the 1970s, fashion was about making a statement, and your feet got the memo. Earth shoes with their negative heel. Platforms that added 3 inches to your height and doubled your chance of twisting an ankle. Teens wore them anyway, because they were different, because they were bold, and because everyone else was doing it. You would clomp through the hallways of your high school like you were on a fashion runway, or at least that is how it felt. You could not sneak up on anyone. The echo of those heels announced your arrival 5 seconds ahead of you. But somehow, that loud clack was part of the power. Your mom called them impractical. Your dad shook his head. But you did not care. These shoes made you feel taller, cooler, louder. You strutted, you stumbled, you survived. And if you were really daring, you paired them with flared jeans and a fringe vest, turning your walk to class into a full-blown event. Looking back, maybe they were not the most sensible shoes, but they carried you through some unforgettable years. One uncomfortable, fabulous step at a time. Canned tomato paste was not something you ate on its own, but it was in everything. You added a spoonful to soup, to sauce, to anything that needed depth on a budget. It was thick, dark, and so concentrated it stained your fingertips. One little can could stretch a meal for 6. You learned to scrape every last bit from the corners with a spoon. It was the base of spaghetti night, chili, casseroles, even homemade ketchup. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive, tomato paste stepped in without complaint. You mixed it with a bit of sugar to cut the bitterness. Sometimes you watered it down and pretended it was marinara. You knew it was a shortcut, but it never felt like cheating. A can of tomato paste gave dinner a backbone, even when the ingredients were bare. It lived in the back of the cupboard, waiting quietly for its turn. No one ever praised it, but nothing tasted right without it. In the 1970s, that tiny can held more than just flavor. It held possibility. Tomato paste was how you made cheap food taste like you tried. The Lite-Brite itself was already a showstopper. Plug it in, stick colored pegs into a black screen, and watch your artwork light up. But here is the kicker. Most kids only had the basic set. Rich kids had the extra refill packs. That meant more templates, more colors, more options. Unicorns, rocket ships, zoo animals, you name it. The refill packs were not cheap. You had to buy them separately, and once they were used, that was it. No do-overs. They had enough pegs to make a Lite-Brite zoo, a Lite-Brite city, a Lite-Brite universe. Their templates were rotated weekly, like gallery installations. Meanwhile, your set still had 2 missing red pegs and a sun that was mostly blue. So most of us rationed them like gold. 1 template per month maybe. But if your family had money, you went through them like printer paper. You would visit a friend's house and see 10 finished Lite-Brite templates pinned to their bedroom wall, full gallery mode. And meanwhile, yours still had that same flower pattern you made 6 months ago. But even if you did not have the extras, you still loved the idea. There was something special about watching your design light up in the dark, even if it was the same one every time. Canned tuna in oil was humble, but reliable. It sat in the back of the cupboard waiting to become tuna salad, a casserole, or a quick sandwich when there was no time or money to spare. A can cost less than $1. You did not overthink it. You just added mayonnaise and moved on. Now those cans are getting smaller while the prices grow. $3 a can for name brand. Even the store brand can sneak past $2 when no one is looking. And that is not even for the kind in water. The kind in oil, once the cheaper, tastier pick, is becoming a premium item. You start checking for sales. You stock up when it is 4 for $5 like it is a luxury you are rationing. Canned tuna used to be about stretching meals. Now it is about stretching dollars. And there is something deeply wrong when the emergency food is no longer affordable. Macaroni and cheese in a box was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, everyone had that orange powder in the cupboard. Boil the pasta, drain it, and stir in butter, milk, and the neon dust. It was dinner in minutes. Some added extras. Most just ate it as is, because it was fast, cheap, and somehow comforting. The cheese sauce was barely cheese, but you loved it anyway. You scraped the pot with a wooden spoon until there was nothing left to lick. Sometimes you added hot dogs, peas, or canned tuna to make it stretch. You never read the directions. You just made it the way your family always had. Even when it clumped or turned runny, it still tasted like home. It filled the kitchen with a smell that said, "You're going to be okay tonight." Kids asked for seconds, and there was rarely enough for leftovers. It stuck to the spoon, clung to the bowl, and stained your tongue if you ate enough of it. In the 1970s, boxed mac and cheese was how you made sure the kids ate something hot, even when the fridge was almost empty. It was shelf-stable, kid-friendly, and budget-approved. Nobody cared that it was not real cheese. They cared that it was there when you needed it. Mac and cheese from a box was not just food. It was a plan that always worked. It looked like something from a spaceship. The Polaroid SX-70 was the first folding instant camera, and when you saw someone snap a photo and watch it develop in seconds, it felt like magic. Rich kids did not just take pictures, they made memories on demand. You had to pay for the camera and the film, which came in little packs that were just as expensive as the camera itself. Most families did not mess with that. Too pricey, too fragile, too much of a risk. But for the kids who had one, it was a golden ticket to popularity. At birthday parties, school trips, sleepovers, you knew who had the camera. They would pass the picture around as it faded into life. Everyone would huddle around like it was a crystal ball. And even if the photo came out blurry, it still felt special. Because you could hold it. You could pin it to a wall or tuck it into a notebook. It was proof that you were there. That moment belonged to you. Unless, of course, you were just standing on the edge of the photo, half in, half forgotten. Ground beef was the hero of the grocery cart. You could get a pound for a couple bucks, stretch it into tacos, meatloaf, spaghetti sauce, sloppy joes, or burgers for a family of 5. It was dinner on autopilot. You browned it, seasoned it, and hoped no one noticed how little meat there actually was. And somehow, it worked. Today, ground beef is a budget buster. You are lucky to find a pound under $6, and that is usually the fatty kind. The kind that shrinks in the pan and leaves half a cup of grease behind. You catch yourself eyeing chicken thighs or vegetarian options just to avoid the sticker shock. Even the marked-down meat bins are not what they used to be. And for folks who grew up on Hamburger Helper and Taco Night, that feels like a punch to the gut. Ground beef was supposed to be the cheap stuff. Now it is something you plan for, something you stretch even further. And if you are buying the good kind, grass-fed, lean, organic, you are treating it like filet mignon. We used to shape it into meatballs with our hands. Now we check the price per ounce with our calculators. Funny how a pound of ground beef can weigh so much more now. The screen lit up, the static speakers crackled, and you knew you were in for something special. Going to the drive-in was not just about the movie. It was about the moment. You crammed into the back of someone's car or sprawled on a blanket with popcorn you smuggled in from home. The movie barely mattered. Sometimes you watched. Sometimes you whispered through the whole thing, passing soda cans and candy bars while trying not to get caught. The smell of summer air, the sound of crickets in the background, it all blended into a night that felt endless. In the 1970s, the drive-in was freedom. No parents hovering, no theater usher flashing a light in your face. Just you, your friends, and a glowing screen under the stars. You could talk, you could laugh, you could fall asleep halfway through the double feature and no one cared. You were not just watching a film, you were living inside one, wrapped in a warm night and cheap snacks and everything that felt right. Even the fog on the windshield felt cinematic. Because you were together, because you were young, and because those nights had a kind of magic that never made it onto the marquee. Saltine crackers were never the star, but they were always in the picture. The box lasted forever and the sleeves got stale faster than you could finish them, but you kept them anyway. They were there when the bread ran out, there when you were sick, there when dinner needed a filler. You spread peanut butter, dipped them in soup, crumbled them into meatloaf. Dry and plain and dusty on your tongue, but still, somehow, comforting. You lined them up on a plate like a snack tray when there was nothing else to serve. They broke easily in your hand, but never let you down in a recipe. Sometimes they were the only side dish on the table. You crunched them late at night when the house was quiet and your stomach was not. No one ever thanked them, but no one ever threw them out either. They lived at the back of every pantry like a safety net made of salt and starch. You wrapped them in napkins and tucked them in lunchboxes like they were gold. Sometimes dinner was just a few saltines and whatever you could scrounge. They held everything together, even when everything felt like it was falling apart. Saltines were not fancy. They were just always there. It looked like a toy until it started playing. The Panasonic Take-and-Tape was a little portable cassette recorder that kids used to tape their voices, play their favorite songs, or pretend they were running a radio show. And it was not cheap. It came in bright colors, had a chunky handle, and most importantly, it worked. It felt professional. Rich kids would bring them to school to record class projects, or worse, just record nothing at all, just because they could. You wanted one, not because you needed it, but because it made sound feel personal. These were the first steps toward a world where kids could make things, songs, stories, messages, and hear them played back. It was powerful. If you had one, you felt like your voice mattered. If you did not, you just watched and wondered how it felt to press record and actually have something worth taping. Bacon used to be a Sunday treat, a crisp slice or two beside scrambled eggs and toast. It was greasy, smoky, salty magic, and affordable enough that you could throw it in a sandwich or wrap it around meatloaf without blinking. You bought a pack, you cooked half, and you ate the rest cold out of the fridge when no one was looking. That was the bacon tax. But these days, bacon is practically a luxury meat. A pack that used to cost $2 is now pushing $8 or even $10, and that is for the regular stuff, not the thick-cut, hickory-smoked artisan strips wrapped in gold foil. Grocery shoppers do double takes. Sales on bacon feel like Black Friday. People swap brands, skip it entirely, or portion it like rationed butter in wartime. You can almost hear the sizzling sound in the skillet crying over how much it cost to get there. Still, some refuse to give it up. Because bacon does not just taste good. It feels like something good. It feels like breakfast at home. It feels like comfort. You might buy less, use it slower, or save it for special meals. But deep down, you still crave it. And even at those prices, bacon still sells out. Back in the 1970s, having an Atari Pong system was like owning the future. It was not just a toy. It was the kind of thing that made your house the coolest one on the block. Rich kids had them hooked up to their living room televisions like it was no big deal. You would walk in and see two little rectangles knocking a square dot back and forth across the screen. But that square dot? It was power. That console cost serious money, and if your family was not ready to drop the equivalent of a couple $100, you were not getting one. Watching the commercials was like torture. They showed families sitting together on shag carpet, laughing like everything was perfect, holding those twisty knob controllers like they had cracked the code on life. It was simple, it was clean, and it felt just out of reach. What made it sting more was that Pong was not flashy. It was just well made. And that made it feel even more exclusive. You knew the kid who had it. You remember standing by awkwardly while they let you play one round and then snatch the controller back. They always had the upper hand. That little blip of a ball? It was the sound of them winning, and you watching from the side. Economy pancake mix came in a cardboard box and gave you more than just breakfast. It was pancakes, waffles, biscuits, even dumplings if you knew how to stretch it. You just added water, sometimes milk if you had it, and mixed until the lumps mostly disappeared. The batter was thin, the pancakes were uneven, but they were warm and they were real. You poured syrup if you had it, jelly if you didn't, and ate them hot off the griddle or cold out of the fridge. They stuck to your ribs and gave you a reason to sit down at the table. Some days it was the only hot thing you ate. You learned to flip them just right, even with a bent spatula and an uneven burner. Some came out burnt, others undercooked, but you ate them all. They filled your plate and quieted your stomach, and that was what mattered. On Sundays, you made extra and saved them in the fridge like treasure. You might roll them up with butter and sugar, or just fold and eat them like a taco. It didn't matter what you called them. If it came from that box, it was breakfast. They were never fancy, but they filled the room with that unmistakable smell that made everything feel okay for a minute. In the 1970s, a box of pancake mix was more than a shortcut. It was a way to turn nothing into something. Economy pancake mix didn't just save breakfast, it saved mornings. It smelled like grease and teenage freedom. Your first job? Maybe it was a burger joint, maybe a fried chicken place. You wore a polyester uniform, punched in on a mechanical time clock, and spent the next 6 hours learning what it meant to really work. You burned your fingers on the fryer, you memorized the register buttons, you smiled at rude customers and cleaned things that no one should ever have to clean. But you did it. For $2 an hour and a free soda at the end of your shift. In the 1970s, getting your first job was a rite of passage. Not just about money, but about growing up, earning something. Standing behind that counter gave you confidence, and maybe a few blisters. You learned how to talk to strangers, how to count back change without a calculator, and how to fake a smile when someone was yelling at you over soggy fries. These jobs weren't glamorous, but they were real. And they taught you more than school ever could. You made friends with coworkers who became your second family. You learned what it meant to take orders, and when it was okay to bend the rules. And even when you swore you would never eat another fry again, part of you loved it, because it was yours. That job was where you first learned to stand on your own, one shift at a time. Canned beets or carrots were not anyone's favorite, but they made the plate look complete. You opened the can, drained the liquid, and served them straight, or maybe warmed them in a little butter. They were soft, too soft sometimes, but you ate them anyway, because in the 1970s, getting vegetables meant buying what you could afford, not what looked best. They added color, nutrition, and just enough balance to a meal made of starch and meat. You did not love them, but you learned to work with them. You mashed them into other dishes when the kids refused to touch them. You glazed them with sugar and crossed your fingers they would pass for something better. Some cans were tastier than others, depending on the brand and the batch. The smell when you opened them was never great, but it faded fast. You knew they were overcooked, but at least they were cooked. They rounded out a meal that might otherwise be missing something green or orange. A little sugar for the beets, a little brown sugar for the carrots. They weren't perfect, but they were enough. Canned vegetables filled the gap between what you wanted and what you had, and they did it quietly. This one was straight up ridiculous, in the best way possible. A miniature pool table, complete with Nerf cue sticks, soft balls, and felt surface. It was like a toy, a game, and furniture all rolled into one. But you needed space. A lot of it. You could not just throw this on the floor and start playing. It took over the basement or a rec room, which meant the kid who had one also had a basement or a rec room. These sets were not cheap either. They came in big boxes and assembling them took time. But when they were set up, they were the crown jewel of the playroom. They were not built for bedrooms or cramped living rooms. They were built for homes with finished basements and quiet carpeted spaces where parents let you leave stuff out. You knew a kid had money when they had rooms dedicated to fun. You could hear the balls clack gently as rich kids lined up their shots like little pros. They wore smug grins while you tried to figure out how to hold the Nerf stick without snapping it. And the worst part? They were not even that into it. They would play a few rounds, get bored, and move on. Meanwhile, you were over there dreaming of owning one for real. Because in a world where everything felt temporary, a pool table, Even a Nerf one felt like luxury you could keep. If these 1970s grocery memories made you smile, share the one you still remember most in the comments. Give this video a like so more people can relive them too, and subscribe to keep traveling back to the shelves of the past with us.